Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Beyond the Chocolate War by Robert Cormier, or Cormier, I've heard it pronounced both ways. Now, this was published in 1985 and is a sequel to Cormier's 1974 debut novel, The Chocolate War. Now, I already reviewed the first book a little over 2 years ago, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out that review. Now, I just want to quickly recap the first novel. The Chocolate War is set at this all-boys Catholic high school called Trinity, where basically the entire student body is run by this club who call themselves the Vigils, and the Vigils would give out these assignments to different students, which typically entails them playing pranks on the teachers or some of their fellow students. And even though the Vigils are clearly bullies, some of the teachers are actually in cahoots with them. Now, the first novel followed this teenage boy named Jerry Renault who refused to take part in the Vigils' stupid assignments, and basically the Vigils launched a campaign of bullying and harassment against this poor kid, but he still stood his ground and refused to play their little games. And unfortunately, the first novel ended with Renault getting the shit kicked out of him and having to go to the hospital. The first novel was very much a commentary on bullying and peer pressure and conformity, and how sometimes people who fight the system or try to go against the grain are literally beaten down by society. And a lot of those same themes definitely carry over into the sequel. Now, I like the first novel a lot. Beyond the Chocolate War felt a little more meandering, to be honest, and it wasn't a bad book, but to me this almost felt more like an extended epilogue of the first novel. And there's also not really a set plot line in this, rather it almost feels more like a day in the life of this school. And unlike the first book, where Jerry was very much our protagonist, this is much more of an ensemble piece where you have multiple characters who could kind of count as the protagonist. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are a lot of other books that could make that work. And like I said, this is not a bad book, but compared to the first book, it is the weaker work in my opinion. Now, the plot of Beyond the Chocolate War is, like I said, it follows multiple characters, but a lot of it centers around Archie Costello, who is the main antagonist of the first book, who's not the leader of the Vigils, but in a lot of ways he might as well be, because he's the one who gives out the assignments, and it turns out all the other Vigils are afraid of him, because this kid is a complete sociopath. But what happens is some of the other Vigils start to rebel against him, particularly his former best friend and right-hand man, Opie, because Opie in the story gets a girlfriend, and it turns out that Archie is kind of jealous of this, and he ends up being indirectly responsible for something really horrible happening between Opie and his girlfriend, and when Opie finds out about this, he now plans revenge against Archie. Meanwhile, Archie's planning revenge against another member of the Vigils who might have alerted Brother Leon about a prank that the Vigils were planning on pulling. We also follow this deeply troubled young man named David Caroni who plans revenge on Brother Leon. Now, Jerry Renault, who is the main character of the Chocolate War, does show up in this, but to be honest, he's much more of a minor character in this novel. But you find out that following the events of the first book, he's completely broken after what the Vigils did to him. We also see the Gruber again, who is Jerry's best friend in the first book, who feels that he kind of betrayed Jerry, tries to reconnect with him, but ultimately they both realize that there's really no salvage in this friendship, even though it's really neither of their faults. Now, the parts of this book that deal with the David Coroni character, I thought were really compelling. Now, I am no expert on suicide or mental health. I certainly have been depressed, but I don't think I've ever been to a point where I wanted to kill myself. So having a very limited knowledge of what that mindset is actually like, when we get into David's head and we see his suicidal thoughts, it feels very true to life. And it's one of the most heartbreaking depictions of a suicidal teenager that I've read. Now, I kind of got this metaphor in the first book, but to me the metaphor is much more in your face in this book. But in both this and the first book, Archie Costello, in a way, kind of represents the devil. Not in a supernatural sense, but if we look at the devil as being a representation of the evil that's within all of us, Archie kind of represents that in this story. And at the end, Opie confronts Archie about all the horrible things that he's done at Trinity, and then Archie turns the tables on him and says, I only got away with this because you guys allowed it. None of you guys actually had to do anything I said. And if we go with the whole Satan allegory, regardless of whether or not you actually believe in the devil as a literal being, I don't personally believe the devil makes us do evil things. We do evil things on our own volition, and Satan is basically the ultimate scapegoat. And that's really what Archie is in both these novels. Rather than Archie really being the problem is actually Trinity itself. There's just something about this school that is inherently rotten. And even pushing aside any religious allegories you could pick up from this, you could look at this as just a metaphor for society in general. I think a lot of the reasons sociopaths thrive in our society so much is because of people who enable them. And that's really what happened with Archie. So many people enabled him, and nobody stood up to him. Yes, Jerry did, and he ultimately paid for it, but if more people backed Jerry up, maybe Archie and the Vigils wouldn't have gotten away with what they did in the first book. Now, even though Archie Costello is clearly the villain of both novels, for me the most evil character in this book was a character named Bunton, who wants to take Archie's place once he graduates. And Bunton, there's a scene in this book where he actually attempts to rape Opie's girlfriend. He doesn't go through with it, but the fact that crossed his mind shows just how despicable this kid actually is. But I think one of the most terrifying things about both Archie and Bunton is we see what they're able to get away with in this school environment. Imagine what they'll be able to do once they graduate and are out in the adult world. And with school violence becoming a much bigger deal in recent years, it makes both this and the first novel almost more relevant today. So yeah, the more that I think about it, this is actually a pretty good book, but it's not as good as the first one, and ultimately I recommend the first one way more, and I also highly recommend the 1988 film adaptation of The Chocolate War. But yeah, that was my review of Beyond the Chocolate War by Robert Cormier, and bye.